Hello, everyone. I am Madeline. I'm the Director of Government Relations here at APN. Will be introducing our guest in a moment. I'm currently here in Chicago at the DNC. This, so forgive the background and hopefully reliable Wi-Fi. So this is going to be a recorded conversation. If you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A chat down at the bottom. And I'll be able to read your questions from there. The raise hand button is not going to work out, so don't use that, please. So yeah, I think we've got a good number of folks who've been able to join, so let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another Americans for Peace Now webinar. Our guest today is Dr. Gershon Baskin. He is the Middle East Director of ICO, the International Communities Organization, Middle East. It's a British non-governmental organization working in conflict zones with failed peace processes. He's also the director of the Holy Land Bond, an impact investment fund for building reconciliation in Israel and Palestine. His weekly column in English now appears in the Times of Israel. Dr. Baskin holds a PhD in international affairs from the University of Greenwich, and he is an author of multiple books, including In Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine. So we are very lucky to have him at this incredibly tense moment. Gershon, thank you for joining us. It's a loaded question, but how are you?
The standard answer I give, I don't know if we say online, but not good, which is how we all are feeling today. Because today we buried 3 of the bodies of hostages that recovered yesterday in Gaza. And yeah, the situation here is definitely not good.
Oh, that is devastating. Our hearts go out to all of you, and we're obviously mourning and holding our breaths for a ceasefire deal. Our main focus today, of course, is this very same ceasefire and hostage release deal. It's clear that people around the world and the mediators sent to the table in Doha want an agreement to stop the violence in Gaza and to bring the Israeli hostages home. But in general, the understanding of how to get from point A, calling for a deal, to point B, getting the government of Israel and Hamas to agree to a deal remains murky for a lot of people. Can you lay out in simple terms what this process actually looks like? Who actually goes to the negotiating table? Is this conversation happening between Israelis and Hamas officials or through intermediaries or other, back channels, things like that? And why Doha as opposed to anywhere else?
Well, a lot of questions. Israel and Hamas don't talk to each other. They have never talked to each other directly. They've never sat in the same room together. I, as an Israeli citizen who's been involved in back channel negotiations, have negotiated with Hamas. In fact, I've even spoken to Hamas from sitting in the headquarters of the department responsible for hostages and prisoners in enemy territories from within the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, where they asked me to call Hamas, and I called Hamas and then offered the phone to the people I was sitting with in the room in the Ministry of Defense, and they turned red and refused to take the phone, of course. So there is no direct contact, which is why there is a need for mediators. The 2 most natural mediators to mediate between Israel and Hamas are Qatar and Egypt. Egypt is the long-term traditional mediator that has mediated multiple ceasefires between Israel and Hamas. They were the key negotiators in the Shalit negotiations and have been involved in the relationship between Israel and Hamas since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007. Qatar is hosting the Hamas leadership, the exiled Hamas leadership. And Qatar is also a state which has funded Hamas. And one could easily say that Qatar is a country that supports terrorism. They have hosted Taliban, they've hosted Al-Qaeda, they have hosted Hamas, and they have funded Hamas as well. Yet, Qatar is an ally of the United States. For those of you who don't know, the largest US military base in the Middle East is in Qatar. And just this past year, the US renewed its lease with Qatar for another 10 years for its military base there. So there are a lot of interests. Qatar also flies one of the most popular airlines in the world and sponsored the World Cup, and basically wants to be accepted around the world and bends over backwards in order to have its image made rosy with lobbyists and PR firms hired in Washington and most of the major capitals of the world. The United States, which has no relation with Hamas and no ability to pressure Hamas, is the natural mediator involved in these talks because, one, there are American hostages amongst the hostages taken, and two, the United States is Israel's backer. And Israel cannot survive without the United States. And I must say that President Joe Biden has taken more of an interest in the Israeli hostages than the Israeli government has. He's met with the hostage families more than the Israeli government has. He's talked about it. He's given more time. It's on his agenda much more frequently than it is on the agenda of Prime Minister Netanyahu. The negotiations have been going on for almost 10 months now. There was a negotiated agreement made between Israel and Hamas that brought home 110 hostages back in November. That deal could have continued beyond the 7 days in which it was implemented. The agreement was that every day Hamas would issue a list of hostages that they were willing to release, including women and children. And on the last day, Hamas issued to Israel a list that included apparently some names of people who were believed to be dead. Israel looked at that as a violation, a breach of the agreement. Israel at that point, when I say Israel, I mean Netanyahu, his government, and the army at that point were eager to get back to the war. And rather than carrying out the agreement for more days, bringing home whatever hostages Hamas was willing to release, Israel went back to war. Blamed Hamas for breaching the agreement, went back to war. What's important to note is that from the very beginning of the war, from at least the first month of the war, Hamas was willing to make a deal to release all the civilian hostage that it was holding, all the women, the children, even wounded and elderly, they were willing to release. They were mostly interested in holding those who were defined as soldiers, both young women soldiers and young men soldiers. Those were the people they wanted to hold. The price that they were demanding was determined by Israel to be too much at that point. They were not talking about a permanent end to the war in the first 2 months of the war, but they were talking about a large release of Palestinian prisoners, and the Israelis, the government, viewed that as a form of surrender, and they didn't want to make the deal. They believed that the military pressure would free the hostages. Everyone was dreaming of Entebbe-like missions, that the special forces would go in, find the hostages, and sweep them into freedom. So far, 7 hostages have been released through military missions. One of them, the first one, was actually because the young woman who was abducted, not by a Hamas person, but by a civilian in Gaza who took her as a sex slave, actually left her to go shopping for some food stuff, and she convinced him to leave her phone saying she was going to play games, and she then called the Israeli army and they came and found her. She was the first hostage who was brought home. The military pressure has not released the hostages and has not advanced the negotiations on the hostages. In fact, what people don't know is that the deal that was done in November was actually delayed for more than 2 weeks as a result of the military pressure, because the deal was being worked out through the Egyptians. They were about to receive a list of names that Hamas was willing to release. And then when Israel started surrounding the city of Gaza and entered toward the Shifa hospital in Gaza, the Hamas froze the process for 2.5 weeks. So military pressure has not worked here. And we know now, more than 10 months into the war, that the military pressure has in fact also killed hostages. The 6 hostages who just recovered their bodies were taken alive into Gaza. They were very likely killed by Israeli bombs. That's what's believed. I don't know if we'll ever know for real, for sure, what happened to them. They may have been killed by Hamas, but the talk around town here is that they were, in fact, killed by Israeli bombs.
That is incredibly devastating, and makes such a case for this, diplomatic negotiations. Not to mention, of course, that these successful Entebbe-style missions that you mentioned have netted significantly high civilian casualties as well. You've been doing peace building work and researching peace and its obstacles for a long time. Obviously, every case is different, but I'm curious what makes this conflict and these negotiations different from the ones that have come before and so challenging?
Yeah, well, the obvious level is that we are experiencing, I mean, Israelis and Palestinians are experiencing the biggest trauma that we have experienced in 76 years. For Israelis, and I think this is for Jews around the world, or Jews who identify as Jews around the world, October 7th, more Jews were killed at one place in one time than at any time since the Holocaust. And to be honest, we in Israel have not left October 7th. We're still there. The stories are still being told every day. We're reliving it every day in the media, on the television, in our newspapers, on the radio. The victims of October 7th having their stories told and new discoveries made every day. So we haven't moved to October 8th. We're still living that trauma. And Palestinians, with now over 40,000 people killed in Gaza, the numbers are probably more likely above 50,000 because there are thousands of unaccounted for people underneath the rubble of buildings that have been demolished. 2 million people homeless in Gaza with no places to go back to. Gaza has been destroyed, has been flattened, its civilian infrastructure demolished, schools, universities. There were 7 working universities in Gaza before the war. Now there are none. They've all been flattened. Governmental institutions, buildings, you name it, streets, roads, water infrastructure, sewage infrastructure. Gaza is a humanitarian disaster, and Palestinians, whether they be in Gaza, inside of Israel, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, or in the Palestinian diaspora, are reliving the Nakba of 1948. For them, it's revisiting the catastrophe that happened to them 76 years ago, and they are reliving it every day. The pictures that they see, both in their Telegram accounts and in WhatsApp, on Instagram, and in other places on Arabic television stations, is much more graphic than anything you will ever see on an American television network or in Israel. In Israel, we don't see the humanitarian disaster of Gaza whatsoever. We see the physical damage that's been done to Gaza, but we don't see the human suffering. And now people are dying there from disease. There are hundreds of thousands of people there with dysentery, with diarrhea, and other skin ailments that are spreading, and there's hepatitis spreading. There's now even the first cases of polio in Gaza, a disease that was eradicated from the world. So this is a total disaster, and that's the prism through which we in Israel and in Palestine are viewing the world now. What that means essentially in terms of looking at each other is that Israelis and Palestinians are incapable of thinking coherently about a tomorrow in which peace might be an option. Yet, there are 2 big surprises that's come out of this war so far. One of them is the rebirth of the 2-state solution. I've been a supporter of the 2-state solution since 1975, when I started university. And yet I thought in the last years that it was no longer alive, that it was dead, it was no longer a viable option, and all of a sudden it's back in front of us. And there are now, I think, 153 countries around the world that have recognized the state of Palestine, and more are coming down the road. And the 2-state solution is what's being talked about in the international community, again, is the only option for bringing about Israeli and Palestinian peace. That doesn't mean that it's around the corner, but if there's one thing that should be clear to anyone who's coherent and rational, is that this has to be the last Israeli-Palestinian war. We can't keep doing this. This has to end, and there needs to be a solution. And the second surprise of this war happened on April 13th, April 14th, when Iran sent 340 rockets, missiles, and drones to Israel, and a regional defensive alliance was born without negotiations and without agreements. And the countries surrounding Israel, including Saudi Arabia, with the help of the United States and Great Britain, defended Israel against the Iranian attack. That should be a telling sign for us about the future place where negotiations on Israel-Palestine need to take place, because the solution can be found within the region, not another Pax Americana, an American-led peace process. We need the United States, perhaps, to initiate this, but the solutions for us are all in the region, creating a new architecture of stability, security, economic development, cross-boundary cooperation, dealing with climate change, and all the other things that the rest of the world deals with. That's where the Israeli-Palestinian solution will be found eventually. So that's the good side of it. The bad side is, of course, that Israel and Hamas don't have a willingness right now to make an agreement to end the war. There are great gaps between the Israeli side and the Hamas side in what they want. And again, when I say the Israeli side, I mean Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet. because the Israeli military and intelligence believe that the deal that's on the table should be accepted. But the government of Israel refuses to end the war, refuses to withdraw the IDF from Gaza, demands to have a physical presence along the Gaza-Sinai border, which is called the Philadelphia Corridor, 14 kilometers of road, where there were smuggling tunnels and where Hamas armed itself, and that border must be secured. But it doesn't have to be secured on the Gaza side of the border. It can be secured on the Egyptian side of the border, with American finance, technology, and personnel supervising and monitoring that the border is in fact sealed. There are other solutions that need to be reached. And the other big gap between Israel and Hamas is on the issue of Palestinian prisoner releases. The Hamas wants thousands of prisoners released. Mostly they want the 600 Palestinian prisoners who are serving life sentences for murdering Israelis released. Israel is willing to release some of them. It wants a veto on the names, and it demands that all the life sentence serving prisoners would be deported forever, and Hamas does not agree to that. So the gaps remain far apart. In my view, and with this I'll end and we can take more questions, the deal that's on the table is not a good deal. The deal that the mediators negotiated is not good for Israel, not good for Hamas, because it is a 6-week deal in the first phase, during which time 33 hostages will be released, what they call the humanitarian release. I don't know what that means, because after 10 months in captivity, they're all humanitarian cases. But 33 hostages would be released. Negotiations would continue on expanding the ceasefire and the redeployment of Israeli forces, and negotiations would further take place on the release of Palestinian prisoners and additional hostages. And I don't know why this has to be drawn out over months, and why the mediators aren't putting down on the table a deal which talks about all 109 hostages in one pulse, with the end of the war in 4 to 6 weeks and a redeployment of Israel out of Gaza. This is what needs to happen. That's the deal that needs to be on the table. We have reached the point where the mediators can no longer negotiate, and if they have integrity, they will stand up and publicize what they've been trying to do and tell the world that they are ceasing their efforts to mediate until the Israelis and Hamas are ready. And the 3 heads of the Israeli negotiating team, the head of the Mossad, Dedi Barnea, the head of the Shabak, Ronen Bar, and the Israeli army general in charge, Nitzan Alon, should all also, if they believe that a deal could be taken and Netanyahu is blocking it, they should notify Netanyahu that they are not willing to negotiate anymore if they have integrity, unless Netanyahu gives them a mandate. One last sentence here. When David Meidan from the Mossad was given the job by Netanyahu to reach a deal with Hamas for freeing Gilad Shalit, David Meidan asked Netanyahu, "What's my mandate?" And Netanyahu said to him, "Bring him home." The negotiators on the Israeli side have not heard from Netanyahu in the last 10.5 months, "Bring them home." That has not been the primary directive of Israel in this war.
Oh, that is, I mean, exactly what it appears on the surface, but it is never gets easier to hear, frankly. I want to turn to some of the dissonance between Netanyahu and the negotiators, and also some reports that we're hearing out of the Biden administration, because I think there's, different reporting coming from different parties. Several times now we've heard from the Biden administration that Netanyahu has agreed to working framework or something like that, and that they're ready to go, only for Bibi then to turn around and say, "No, I didn't." One, like, what actually do you know what is actually true? But also, what is the philosophy behind this? Some people think it's the US trying to force his hands. Other people think it's more that the US and negotiators have figured it out, and then Netanyahu disagrees. But is this something that is damaging to US credibility as a mediator in this process?
Yeah, when President Biden presented what he called the Netanyahu plan back in May, it seemed to me that President Biden went beyond what Netanyahu had in fact agreed to. The main point on which President Biden went beyond what Netanyahu agreed to was when he said that once the 6-week ceasefire begins, and negotiations are ongoing. Even if they don't reach an agreement on phase 2, the ceasefire would stay in place. That, to the best of my knowledge, is not what Netanyahu agreed to or what Netanyahu said. And I think that Biden was trying to force Netanyahu's hand. But it soon became very clear, because in the negotiations themselves, the Israeli team put all these red lines and conditions on the table that they were told by Netanyahu to deliver to the Egyptians and the Qataris. And then Hamas simply issued statements saying that what Biden said is not what Israel agrees to, that Israel doesn't agree to ending the war, and the Hamas was demanding an obligation that the war would end. In fact, what I believe, and pretty much know for sure, is that the United States assured the Qataris and the Egyptians that once the ceasefire began, it would continue. It would become what Biden called a sustainable ceasefire. That's what the Qataris and the Egyptians told Hamas. And then when the Israeli negotiators came up and said, no, if the negotiations don't reach a conclusion by the end of the first 6 weeks, Israel will resume the war. And it was very clear that Netanyahu had no intention to end the war. Now it's very clear that even though Secretary Biden and Secretary Blinken and President Biden both said that Israel agreed to the American bridging proposals, which we don't have all the details of, Netanyahu spoke yesterday to 2 different groups of families of soldiers who were killed in Gaza, who are on the right wing of the Israeli maps, Netanyahu supporters. And in those meetings, Netanyahu was quoted as saying that we will not end the war, we will not withdraw from Gaza, and Israel will remain on the Philadelphia corridor. This, I imagine, is not in full accord with what was painted as the American bridging proposals. And of course, Hamas immediately rejected it. Hamas today, in the Telegram account of Ezzedin al-Qassam, the military wing of Hamas, put out a call to Egypt and Qatar to stop mediating until Israel gets serious about the negotiations, as they wrote. That's the state of the negotiations right now. The gaps are still very far apart. And I'll remind everyone that 109 Israeli hostages are still in Gaza. And the war continues every day with more and more people getting killed. One thing is absolutely sure to me and clear is that the longer Israel stays in Gaza, the more I can guarantee that there will be armed insurgency against Israeli soldiers, and Israeli soldiers will come back dead from Gaza. And the easier it is for Hamas to recruit new recruits, because they recruit their young people from bereaved families and people who have lost their homes, which is almost every single person in Gaza. And while the hatred and anger against Hamas is reaching a boiling point amongst residents of Gaza, as long as the Israeli army remains in Gaza, they will have new recruits. There is no total victory over an ideology, over an idea, and Hamas is more than a government and more than a military. It is an idea and is an ideology, and it grew out of an opposition to the occupation, out of opposition to what people believed was a peace process that was doomed to fail. And it remains that way. The only way to effectively fight an ideology like Hamas, which promises its people the glory of death for Palestine, is to promise the Palestinian people that they can live for Palestine, that there is a Palestine they can live for, that there is a political horizon, there is a hope, there is something to live for. I mentioned earlier, there were 7 working universities in Gaza with tens of thousands of students every year studying everything from computers to law to medicine to everything. And when they completed their studies, they had no jobs and no future. And that was why there was nearly 70% youth unemployment of Gaza people under the age of 30. Unemployed, nearly 70% before the war. So this war didn't happen in a vacuum. There's history here that led up to where we got to.
So you mentioned how, Hamas has said, we don't want to talk anymore until you're serious and you're ready to, have your negotiators actually represent what, the government of Israel is willing to concede. I want to talk about some of the other carrots and sticks, as one might phrase it. What can the United States do here, or other intermediaries, to kind of urge the parties or push the parties into it? I had a question in the chat from someone who wanted to ask about the use of U.S. military assistance, and whether, some of the arms transfers we're seeing, or, the national security memorandum, which the Biden administration issued much earlier this year, and later certified that Israel was in compliance with international and U.S. Humanitarian law, which one might argue is not accurate. And certainly members of Congress have pushed back against that assessment. So I wanted to ask you, what kinds of tools do you think would actually get Bibi to the table?
Right. So it's not only Bibi. And the United States has serious diplomatic tools, carrots and sticks in their diplomatic toolbox vis-a-vis Israel. The Egyptians and the Qataris have significant carrots and sticks that they could use against or with Hamas. For United States, there's the doomsday leverage. And the doomsday leverage is the political cover that the United States provides for Israel in the international arena, mostly the Security Council with the US veto. That is very significant. And the other doomsday point of leverage is also, you mentioned, is the shipment of bombs to Israel to drop on Gaza. And the United States could say to Israel, we're not going to fuel the war in Gaza anymore. We have your back. If you're attacked by Iran, if you're attacked by Hezbollah, there are US warships right now in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea, and in the Persian Arab Gulf, there to protect Israel. And that's really important. But there's absolutely no reason why the United States should be fueling the war in Gaza at this point. And it should have been stopped, in my view, a long time ago. But this is certainly something that the US can hold over Israel and say, no more. This war has to end. You're going to end it. We're not going to provide you with those bombs anymore. And that's a blow to Israel. I don't know how much of a blow it is to the Israeli arsenal. I think that Israel has a lot of weapons stockpiled. But for Israel to be hit in that way by almost its only ally left in the world today is devastating. And it's the kind of devastation that could actually lead to bringing down Netanyahu. If we remember back to the days of Yitzhak Shamir, when we had the massive immigration from the former Soviet Union, and over policy on the Israeli-Arab track, the US threatened Israel not to issue loan guarantees for Israel to have money to build housing for the million Russians who are coming. That led to the downfall of Yitzhak Shamir and the election of Yitzhak Rabin in 1992. That had a direct impact on the Israeli electorate. So this is very important. It could be done. The Egyptians have leverage on Hamas because Egypt is the lifeline of Gaza. There are also 160,000 Gazans who escaped Gaza and are living now illegally in Cairo. And amongst them are Hamas people, not just civilians who ran away, who had the financial means to run away, but there are also Hamas people there. And Egypt hosts Hamas people. There's a Hamas office in Cairo. It facilitates the movement of Hamas people around the region. So there's a lot of leverage there. And the Qataris, of course, are hosting the Hamas leadership. The Qataris could say to the Hamas leadership, your families have to pack their bags tomorrow. They're no longer welcome here. And if you don't bring agreement, then the day after tomorrow, you all have to leave as well. And of course, Qatar funds their stay in Qatar and funded billions to Gaza over the years. So they have leverage that can be used. I don't think it's being used. I don't think these doomsday weapons have been taken out of the diplomatic toolbox, and they need to be.
We agree with you on that. We very strongly feel that U.S. military assistance should reflect our values and our policy priorities. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other potential motivations in here, and external forces urging Netanyahu. There's news recently, I'm sure you saw, or reports, I should say, not confirmed, that former President Trump and Netanyahu had a conversation recently where Trump may have urged Netanyahu to delay the agreement, as it's obviously been hurting Democrats in the campaign. Do you see any relationship between the negotiations and American politics? Obviously, negotiations and the war is impacting us, but does that go two ways?
No, I think it's playing here, and I think that the fact that the Biden administration and the Kamala Harris campaign want this issue removed from the campaign agenda is very significant. I hope it reflects itself in the policies of President Biden. I think we've seen some pretty firm statements from Kamala Harris about the need to end the war. Ironically, we've seen similar statements from Donald Trump. There is perhaps the only issue on which there is agreement between Democrats and Republicans right now is Trump said to end the war quickly. Of course, Trump believes probably that there is an ultimate victory, and if Israel just bombs the hell out of Gaza more than they've already done, that would lead to ending the war. I don't know what that man thinks. He's the most dangerous person in the world, and he's unpredictable. So we really don't know what he thinks, but I think this is part of the issue. There were rumors about the Trump-Netanyahu conversation. It was denied by the Prime Minister's office that such a conversation took place. That doesn't mean that it didn't. There is no doubt that Netanyahu is a Republican and Netanyahu wants Trump to win those elections. There's no doubt that when he was planning to make his speech in Congress, had President Biden not stepped out of the race, he would have been speaking in the US Congress to Donald Trump. And his message would have been, I'm your man, I'm not weak, I don't surrender, I'm going to beat them. It would have been the pumped up testosterone message that Donald Trump likes to hear. He was a little thrown off base when Kamala Harris stepped in and started rising quickly in the polls, and then had to confront the possibility that she actually might be the next president of the United States, and he had to modify his speech. But we know where Netanyahu stands, and it's entirely possible that Trump and Netanyahu agreed not to end the war, which wouldn't take very much convincing because Netanyahu doesn't want to end the war. When this war ends, there will be an overwhelming majority for new elections in Israel. There already is, but there's an argument of should it happen before the war ends or not. Netanyahu has lost his popularity in Israeli society. He's gaining the polls recently, but there's still no way, if elections were held today, that he could make a coalition. No way. And an overwhelming majority of Israelis, more than 80% of Israelis, want a national investigation into what happened on October 7th and what led up to October 7th and what happened after October 7th. And that's a national commission headed by a Supreme Court judge with the ability to subpoena witnesses, including the Prime Minister, and documents, and to issue penalties and punishments, or indicate that they should be issued. And Netanyahu doesn't want that. Netanyahu is going to try to avoid that by trying to create a governmental commission of inquiry in which the government sets the mandate and appoints the people. And basically, it's a commission with no teeth and would be meant to cover up Netanyahu's responsibility. So all these issues are very important. And American relations with Israel. Israel is more dependent on the United States today than it has ever been. And that's very clear to every single Israeli.
I'm going to ask a question that will hopefully inject some positivity into this conversation. Obviously, It's really, really challenging topic, and I'm sure we're still going to go back to some of the difficult elements of it. But this question comes from Ori Neer, our now retired but very beloved Vice President of Communications, no longer at APN, of course. So Ori, hi, glad to have you on. He writes asking about an article you wrote in January in the Jerusalem Post, predicting that the trauma from October 7th will help the Israeli left gain power. Do you still believe that? And can you walk us through your thinking there?
Yeah, I had a piece published today in the Times of Israel called Rebuilding Hope. So it was also a hopeful piece. And I have a very close Palestinian friend named Samer Sinjalawi, someone that you should definitely host. Samer is a member of the Fatah leadership in opposition to Mahmoud Abbas. He's amongst the young generation who want democracy and accountability and is against corruption, and believes that the major task of the Palestinian leadership has to be to make peace with Israel. Samer visited Kfar Aza 2 weeks after the war and was filmed in a documentary, I think, made by the American by the ADL, I think the film was made, in which he stood up and said, "I'm sorry. I'm here to voice my disgust and remorse by what happened in my name. I didn't do it, but it was done in my name, and we have crossed moral red lines that should never be crossed." And it was quite a remarkable statement. And I've spoken a lot with Samer at universities and to Israeli audiences, and Jewish audiences, and other international meetings, and even Palestinian audiences. And I rediscovered something that I knew a long time ago, which is the power of remorse. If there is going to be a renewed peace process out of the trauma that we're living, it will be when Israelis and Palestinians of courage stand up and say, "This was done in my name, and I'm sorry. We should never cross these moral red lines again. What we've done to each other, we should never do again." This is very powerful. When I talk about rebuilding hope, it's about recognizing that even when this war is over, there will remain 7 million Palestinian Arabs and 7 million Israeli Jews living on the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. We're not going anywhere. When I made that recognition back in 1975, after spending a year in Israel on Young Judea year course, and I came back and tried to understand what this intensive Zionist experience was that I lived over the course of the year, and I had already known that Israel was going to be my home. One of the first conclusions I came to was that if Israel truly wants to be, as it defines itself, the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, we cannot rule over another people and deny them their right to self-determination that we claim for ourselves, nor can we deny equal rights to the 2 million Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel. It simply doesn't work. We are neither the democratic nation state of we're not the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, when between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there's no longer a clear Jewish majority, and most of the Palestinians living here don't enjoy democracy. So that kind of awakening is something that needs to happen, and I believe will happen. Our problem, our main problem, is our total lack of leadership. We have no leadership of inspiration, not in Israel and not in Palestine at this point. And this is really terrible. The arena of potential politicians out there beyond Netanyahu are not inspiring, and are not leaders, and are not people who can make brave decisions, because we know what needs to be done. The return of the two-state solution is the best thing that can happen to all of us. And with all the obstacles in place, it can still be done. And there are formulas to make it happen. But the first prerequisite for that happening is leadership. And I believe, having been part of 40 weeks of demonstration against the attempt to overthrow our judicial system here, and then weeks and weeks and months of demonstrations since the war began here for the hostages and now for new elections, there's a whole new generation of Israelis who have risen into positions of leadership, of leading mass protest movements in Israel. And I know that amongst them is the future leadership of the state of Israel. And I know from my Palestinian friends and colleagues that I work with that there are new leaders out there who are not willing to adopt the strategy that has failed them for 76 years. My friend Samer, for instance, says, if I were the foreign minister of Palestine, I would close 100 of the 110 embassies that we have around the world, and I would open up 100 branches of the Palestinian government in towns and cities all around Israel. Because Israel, the Israeli people, as Samer says, are not the enemy, they're our solution. And we will get what we need to get when we learn how to address Israeli fear. It's Israeli fear that's our enemy, and not the Israeli people. It's through working with the Israeli people that we will get our freedom. And I think that's a very positive, uplifting message. And if more people can recognize that, we can find the path forward.
Agreed. So I do have a question from someone in the chat about how Palestinians, or some Palestinians, have consistently said no two states. Although I will say that many Palestinians don't say that. And, at times, I think we're seeing polling where it's not necessarily no two states, but it's like a lack of belief that two states can happen at the most hopeless point, not necessarily about popularity of an actual two-state solution. But can you speak to that question of,
Sure.
you know,
There is no such thing as a one-state solution. If we believe there was one before October 7th, October 7th proves that it's not a viable reality, that we can live together in peace in one single state, a unitary state, a civilian state, a democratic, secular state. It doesn't exist in reality. We have to face the fact that for more than 100 years, Jews and Arabs have been killing each other in this land over territory and identity. It's who owns this land and who gives its identity to it and who takes its identity from it. It's really interesting if you read the Israeli and Palestinian declarations of independence, they are mirror documents of each other. And they both claim that they are the people of this land and they have given their identity to this land and they have taken their identity from the land. And they're mirror images of each other. So if the war people have been willing to fight and die over whose land this belongs to, the idea that we are willing to give up our identity to create a state which does not reflect our nationality or ethnicity or our religion is in a different planet. It's not the planet in which Israelis and Palestinians live. I know many Palestinians who say, one state or two states, I don't care. You Israelis negotiate between yourselves and decide and tell us what you want, and we'll accept it. Many Palestinians would prefer a one-state solution because they see all of Palestine as theirs, and they would like to live in any place in Palestine. But if there was a viable two-state option, most Palestinians would say, yes, I'll take it. If it's going to guarantee me my freedom, my equality, the end of the Israeli occupation and my suffering, I'll take it. And I think there's a great deal of validity in that statement that we Israelis need to negotiate amongst ourselves before we even start negotiating with the Palestinians, because we are deeply divided in this society on what kind of solution, if any, we want to the Palestinian issue. So I think it's a very valid argument when Palestinians say, we don't know what you want. Tell us what you want, and then we'll know how to deal with it. So I really think that's a challenge to us. And I think that models like a land for all or two states, one homeland provide a lot of inspirational answers on how we Jews can see the whole land of Israel as being our homeland, and how Palestinians can see all the land of Palestine as being their homelands without necessarily having sovereignty over all of it. We can have a differentiation between citizenship and residency rights, just like exists in the European Union. You could be a Polish citizen living in Berlin with all the rights to a German living in Berlin, except the right to vote for the German parliament. You vote in the Polish parliament, but you live in Berlin as an equal citizen there or resident. We could have a similar situation here eventually where there are Palestinians living in Israel as equal rights, not only the Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also Palestinians from Gaza, from the West Bank, from the diaspora, as well as Jews legitimately living in the state of Palestine. I like to remind people that when we read the Torah portion every Shabbat, every week, we're not telling the stories of the beaches of Tel Aviv. We're telling the stories of the hills and the valleys of Judea and Samaria. That's where our heritage lies. And whether there is a border, a green line, which is a hard border, an open border, it doesn't reduce the reality that that's part of our ancient heritage. Just as Palestinians, Haifa, Ramle, Akko, and Lud are part of their homeland and part of their heritage and part of their memory. So maybe there are ways that we can find to expand the current ideas that we know of as the classic two-state solution and find other ways of implementing it. In the plan written by Ehud Olmert, when he was negotiating with Mahmoud Abbas back in 2008, he, for instance, proposed that the old city of Jerusalem would have no sovereign. There wouldn't be an Israeli flag, there wouldn't be a Palestinian flag. Over the old city of Jerusalem, which is 1 square kilometer, a tiny piece of land where all the holy places are, there would be 5 countries that would serve as guardian of the old city: the United States, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And it's a brilliant idea because it recognizes the Jewish connection and the Muslim connection, and also makes Jerusalem, the important part of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, into an international city where everyone can have a piece of it, but we don't own it. Jerusalem belongs to the world. It doesn't belong to one of us.
That's so well said, and what a beautiful vision that you paint. Not to bring us back down to less beautiful ideas. I have a couple questions in the chat from folks. One, I think we can answer quickly because you did speak about this bit, but I do have a question from someone who asks about whether or not any dispute over oil rights plays a part in this conflict. I'm just going to go ahead and take that, which is there is no oil there.
No, we don't have oil. We have gas fields, and there is a Gaza gas field that Ariel Sharon granted the rights to Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians, and they have negotiated agreements with other gas companies in the world to do the drilling. They thought that they had an anchor customer in the Israeli Electric Corporation that was going to be the main purchaser and made the investment of about $250 million to drill the gas. But the Israeli Electric Corporation pulled out of that deal many years ago. And the owners of the field, I think it's Shell today, but I'm not 100% sure, are not going to spend $250 million when a war is going on and where the gas can't be safely pulled out of the ground and sold to customers around the world. And the Palestinians are really banking on the Gaza gas field as part of their economic miracle that will save them in the future.
Thank you. Yeah. So like you said, this war is about identity and that connection to the land. So that brings me, to one of the kinks, we should say, in this EU version of Israel and Palestine in the future, and that is violent settlers and how to deal with them. Obviously, we can get into the executive order that President Biden issued earlier this year and the ways that that's been implemented. So we can talk about that briefly. I know we have like very little time left, so I'm sorry. And I do
You're
want to
talking in the immediate response to violent settlers or in future peace
I think in a
arrangement?
future agreement, because right now we have the United States is putting on some significant pressure, and we're sanctioning violent settlers and those who support them.
Right.
And the sanctions
and don't forget the International Criminal Court in The Hague as well.
Yes, that's although less enforceable within Israel, but sure, exactly.
It makes Israel a lot smaller for a lot of people who are going to have warrants of arrest against them issued. In any event, in the long term, presuming that we do reach a two-state solution and there is an agreed border between Israel and Palestine, it will involve annexing a maximum of 4.4% of the West Bank in exchange for equal territory within Israel. I say 4.4 because that's the maximum amount of land available within Israel proper that could be swapped with the Palestinians. But that would include between 75 and 80% of the settlers. Remember, the overwhelming majority of settlers live in two settlements, which are ultra-Orthodox, Beitar Illit and Modi'in Illit. That's the bulk of the settlers. But the main problematic population are the ones who live in the central mountains of the West Bank and in Samaria. And they are the most problematic and the most violent of them. And there's simply going to have to be two things that are done. One is that in the agreement, there has to be an agreement to the state of Palestine that Jews can live in the state of Palestine. It is not reasonable to expect that the state of Palestine would be Judenrein. Jews should be welcome to live there, not as settlers, not as armed militia, not as people with special rights, but living under Palestinian sovereignty, under Palestinian law. I think that there will be very few settlers who will agree to that. But nonetheless, as a matter of principle, Palestine, as a democratic country in the future, should have a Jewish minority. Minorities are good for democracies. They help us be better democracies, and Palestine should have one. Salam Fayyad, the former Palestinian prime minister, once said to me, we would welcome Jewish citizens of our state or residents of state, and we will grant them exactly the same rights that the Palestinian citizens of Israel get, which I thought was a brilliant statement to encourage Israel to grant Palestinian citizens of Israel greater freedom and greater rights. In any event, the violent settlers will have to be dealt with in a way that they understand. Their weapons will have to be taken away by the Israeli army who gave them their weapons, and they have to be notified of a time schedule that when the Israeli army will no longer be there to protect them. And they have a choice to come home to Israel proper or to the settlements that will be part of the annexed lands where they can remain in Israel, remain in Judea and Samaria, or stay there and face whatever consequences they may have. But we cannot tolerate a minority group of spoilers to prevent the people of Israel and the people of Palestine from enjoying peace. We were not serious about this enough during the Oslo peace process, and this is one of the lessons of that failed process. There are many lessons of the failed process, but dealing with the spoilers with much more determination and much more clarity is something that's going to have to be dealt with when we have negotiations again. There are also Palestinian spoilers who use violence and will use violence to destroy the chances of peace as well.
Yes, well, the right on both sides have clearly fueled each other, and that's obviously part of what's gotten us to this situation. Speaking of the right, we have very little time left, and this is a huge question, so I apologize. But I'm going to combine a few questions from the chat. The crux of it is, does this conflict help preserve, or does this current war help preserve Netanyahu's political situation? Obviously, he's highly unpopular, but at the same time, he's able to prevent elections from happening. We know that he needs to stay in power in order to, prevent his own personal legal troubles from catching up to him. So can you talk a bit about that? And
yeah, I think it goes. Sorry.
I said I think I have one more question from someone.
Okay.
Sorry. Give me 2 seconds. Yeah, and is he, one of the obstacles is this personal desire to save himself part of why we haven't seen a deal yet?
Yeah, there's no question that Netanyahu is putting his own personal political interest ahead of the interest of the country. And the problem with Netanyahu is not his legal problems. That's the least of it. The corruption that he represents in Israeli society is the minority of the problem that we face with Netanyahu. Netanyahu strategically designed and implemented a plan which removed the peace option with the Palestinians from the table. When you consider that we had 5 rounds of elections where the issue of Palestine wasn't even discussed, the two-state solution wasn't discussed at all. Instead, we were talking about managing the conflict or reducing the conflict or anything but resolving the conflict. And the empowerment of Hamas in Gaza and the weakening and delegitimation of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank was Netanyahu's strategy, which he successfully implemented to remove Palestine from the agenda. He succeeded in convincing Donald Trump, and who managed to surprisingly convince the Emirates and Bahrain to do the Abraham Accords, in which they tossed the Palestinians under the bus and broke out of the Arab Peace Initiative, which the Arab states held firm to from 2002 until today. And Netanyahu was able to convince a majority of Israelis and a majority of people in the world that the Palestinian issue could be managed. We don't have to deal with it. But October 7th changed that. On October 7th, the Palestinian issue blew up in our faces. And we will never return to a situation where we can ignore it. Never. So the problem with Netanyahu staying on is not his legal problems, but his continued commitment to prevent Israel from ever negotiating a genuine peace with the Palestinian people. And that will limit our ability to make peace with the Saudis and other Arab countries and Islamic countries, and we need to do that. We need to get rid of Netanyahu because he endangers our security. He endangers the well-being and the moral code of the state of Israel. He is a disaster. He is a person who believed before October 7th, and he said this, that he would go down in history as the greatest leader of the Jewish people since Moses, when in fact he will go down as the worst leader that the Jewish people have ever had. And that's how he needs to be written in the history books. It is unimaginable. I shouldn't say unimaginable because it is actually imaginable, but it is disastrous to imagine that after all he has done and his refusal to take responsibility and to deflect the responsibility for October 7th onto everyone except himself, mainly the Israeli army and the intelligence, who are definitely to blame for what happened on October 7th. He is the head and he is responsible. And if Israel re-elects him to be prime minister, that's a signal to me, as someone who's dedicated my life to this country and has been living here for 46 years, that this place is not repairable. And that will be the saddest day in my life. I can't believe that we could arrive at that day. We should never be there, and we should never allow this man to be reelected. as the prime minister of this country. And that's the task of every single one of us in America and here, to ensure that this guy can never be back as the leader of this country.
I wholeheartedly agree. So I'm gonna, I think this is a perfect point to end, because I know we have a lot of questions left and a lot more we could talk about, but I think that each question is going to require another like 20 minutes, and I don't want to keep folks for that long. So thank you.
Well, everyone can contact me if you want. My email is myname@gmail.com, one word. I'm on Twitter and on X, whatever it's called, on Facebook, on Instagram. You can find me easily. Or WhatsApp, you can find my phone number online also. WhatsApp me.
Wow. Well, thank you for that very generous offer. You've been already so generous with your time. And now I know we're all going to be bugging you with our questions, because this is unfortunately doesn't seem to be resolving as quickly as I think we had all hoped it would. I know when we scheduled this webinar, in our hearts, we were all really, really crossing our fingers that we'd be having a different conversation about how the hostage release deal had been achieved. So next time we speak, we will be having.
Inshallah.
Yes. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Gershon. And
thank you.
see you all next time.